Have you ever felt completely, just utterly exhausted just from thinking about someone else?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And I don't mean, the physical toll of like helping a friend move furniture all weekend. I mean the unseen, relentless mental gymnastics.
Right. The rumination.
Exactly. Like
Yeah.
you spend hours anticipating their moods before they even walk into a room.
Yeah.
Or you replay a mundane, 5-minute conversation for 3 days straight, trying to analyze every single inflection.
Every slight pause. Yeah.
Yeah. You worry about their approval, or you find your heart rate spiking as you try to decode a completely neutral 2-word text message. We all do this to varying degrees. And society kind of gives us a reassuring pat on the back for it,
Yeah.
We call it care. We romanticize it as devotion.
We do. We reward it, really.
But according to the profound psychology and philosophy we're exploring today, this exhausting mental looping might actually be, the exact opposite of love.
Yeah.
It might be the gradual, silent abandonment of yourself.
It requires a deeply uncomfortable shift in perspective to look at our own behavior this way. I mean, it really does. We are conditioned to believe that love is basically synonymous with mental preoccupation.
Right. Like if I'm thinking about you, I care about you.
Exactly. If I'm always thinking about you, I must care. But when another person occupies that much cognitive and emotional real estate in your mind, you lose access to your own inner world. You aren't experiencing connection. You're experiencing a state of psychological dismissment.
Wow. The sources we have on the table today offer this brilliant, really unexpected pairing to help us explore this exact tension. We're looking at Carl Jung's foundational psychological theories, specifically his work on projection and the development of the self.
Which is heavy stuff, but so vital.
Really vital. And we are intertwining them with the modern philosophical insights of Joe Bondra, drawn from his book, Finding Neva. And there is a beautiful little detail worth highlighting right at the start. Neva is actually heaven spelled backwards.
I love that detail.
Right. It serves as this perfect structural symbol for the idea that paradise or peace or wholeness, it isn't some external destination you can just travel to. It's a journey backwards, retreating inward to uncover the sacred ground that already exists within yourself.
That inward return is really the overarching theme of our discussion today. It's the journey back to wholeness. We are looking at the mechanics of how we lose ourselves and the deliberate practices required to find our way back.
Okay, let's unpack this, because Jung starts us off with a cognitive concept that honestly upends how we think about daily relationships. He suggests that most of the time we aren't even interacting with real people.
Yeah, Jung proposed this rather radical idea that human beings rarely encounter one another with objective clarity. Instead, we basically encounter our own psychological projections.
Which sounds a little abstract, so how does that actually work?
Well, the mechanism here is fascinating. When you have unprocessed emotions, fears, or insecurity, say, a deep-seated feeling of unworthiness, the brain finds it too painful to hold that tension internally.
So it has to put it somewhere.
Exactly. It unconsciously externalizes it. It takes that unworthiness, casts it onto someone else like a movie projector onto a blank screen, and suddenly you are convinced that they are judging you.
Oh, wow.
You create an inner simulated version of a person, attach all your unresolved meaning to it, and interact with that internal construction. The person in your head becomes significantly more powerful than the actual human being standing right in front of you.
It's like playing a multiplayer video game, but you're actually just playing against a computer simulation you programmed yourself.
Yeah.
And it's completely based on your own fears.
Yeah.
You think you're strategizing against a real player across the globe, but you're just fighting your own source code.
That video game analogy fits perfectly because the underlying neurology supports it. Your brain is a prediction machine. It is constantly rehearsing and interpreting. So when you carry around a psychological universe built around someone else, you are hyper-analyzing their every sigh or glance to confirm the narrative you've already written. You aren't seeing them. You are seeing your own psychological material reflected back at you.
But I have to push back here for a second, because humans are, we're biologically wired for connection. We survived as a species by paying really close attention to the social cues of our tribe.
Of course.
So if I'm highly attuned to my partner or my best friend, isn't that just proof of healthy bonding? How do we separate functional, healthy attention from this obsessive simulated video game dynamic you're talking about?
That's the key question, isn't it? And the distinction lies in what Jung called participation mystique.
Participation mystique.
Right. This is a psychological state where emotional boundaries dissolve to the point that your identity becomes totally fused with the other person or the group. You mistake enmeshment for intimacy.
Oh, that's a dangerous trap.
It is. In a healthy state of attention, your nervous system remains regulated independently. You can offer connection and empathy while preserving your individuality. You see the other person clearly because you are grounded in your own physical and emotional reality.
So I'm me and you're you.
Exactly. But obsessive attention operates on a different mechanism entirely. It creates structural dependence. Your emotional baseline is essentially outsourced to their reactions.
So if they have a bad day, I have a bad day.
Worse than that, if they are warm, your brain releases dopamine and you feel safe. If they are distant, your amygdala fires and you spiral into panic. You aren't actually relating to them, you know. You are utilizing them as an external tool to regulate your own nervous system.
Wow. Okay, so if healthy love preserves individuality, but this obsessive focus essentially destroys it, we are forced to confront a really terrifying question. If the person we are fixating on in our mind isn't entirely real, and we are just performing these panicked reactions to our own projections, who are we? Like, who is the me doing all this projecting?
That's where Bandra's Finding Nevers really steps in to elevate this from clinical psychology into deep existential philosophy. Bandra forces us to examine the mechanics of the ego.
And we usually think of ego as just arrogance, right?
Right. And it isn't just arrogance. It is a highly sophisticated organizing principle in the mind. To protect us from the terrifying vastness of existence, the ego constructs elaborate narrative identities. We stitch together layers of identity to give ourselves a false sense of permanence.
Like we rely on labels. Things like, I am a successful entrepreneur, or I am the dependable parent, or even latching onto the negative ones, which can honestly feel just as defining.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, I am the anxious one, or I am fundamentally broken.
And Bandra makes a really profound observation about those negative labels. The ego does not prioritize happiness. It prioritizes survival and continuity.
Wow. So it would rather be miserable and know who it is.
Precisely. Sometimes we actively cling to our suffering because it provides a durable identity. The victim, or the eternal rescuer who must always sacrifice themselves to fix everyone else's crises, these become highly familiar, predictable roles. Unknown misery is neurologically safer to the ego than the unknown void of not having a label at all.
Which brings in Bander's concept of dualism, because the mind seems to constantly slice the world into these opposing categories to make sense of it, right?
Yeah, dualism is the brain's innate categorization engine, but it's misapplied to consciousness itself. We naturally divide the physical world into opposites to navigate it hot versus cold, up versus down.
Sure, that's just basic survival.
Right. But the ego applies this to identity, dividing reality into us versus them, success versus failure, and most importantly, self versus other. This cognitive division creates the ultimate illusion of fundamental separation.
So we feel totally alone.
Yes. Once you buy into the belief that you are an isolated, separate fragment disconnected from the rest of existence, existential fear is the only logical result. You are now a fragile entity that must defend its little isolated ego against an indifferent universe. You have to aggressively maintain your roles or you face psychological annihilation.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. If my roles, my career achievements, my relationship to my family, my historical traumas, if those aren't the core of who I am, it sounds like we're advocating for total emotional detachment.
I can see why it sounds that way.
Right, because if I strip away my job title, my relationships, and my defining struggles, isn't life just a barren wasteland? Like, what is actually left? Am I just supposed to be a floating orb of nothingness?
That terror of emptiness is the exact mechanism that keeps the ego in power. We cling to the masks because we think the mask is all there is, but Bandra threads the needle beautifully here. He clarifies that the roles themselves are not inherently evil or problematic.
Okay, so I don't have to quit my job and move to a cave.
No, not at all. Your career, your role as a parent, your artistic pursuits, these are vibrant, temporary expressions of the human experience. The pathology doesn't lie in possessing the role. The pathology lies in believing you are the role. True identity is not the shifting narrative. It is the steady awareness that is experiencing the narrative.
The awareness. So the quiet, observant part of my mind that is like watching me have this conversation with you right now, noticing the sound of my own voice.
Yes, the witnessing presence behind the thought stream. That underlying awareness is entirely unaffected by a career failure. It doesn't age when the body ages. It requires zero external validation to exist.
Oh, that's incredibly freeing.
It is, because when you shift your identification from the role to the awareness, you bypass detachment entirely.
Yep.
You actually become free to engage with the roles passionately because the terror of losing them has vanished. Your core self is no longer at stake if the narrative changes.
But let's look at the origin of that terror for a minute. Because we aren't born with these elaborate ego defenses, An infant isn't obsessively projecting their insecurities onto the people around them. This points directly to the childhood origins of these patterns.
Absolutely. Jung suggests that the obsessive outward focus, this constant scanning of other people's emotional states, it actually begins as a vital childhood survival mechanism. It is an adaptation of the developing nervous system.
So if a child grows up in an environment where the emotional climate is unpredictable or hostile, they don't have the luxury of turning inward to cultivate their own identity.
Right.
They are forced to direct all their cognitive resources outward to manage the environment.
It functions like a predictive algorithm coded during a hurricane. A child in an unstable home learns that physical or emotional safety depends entirely on anticipating the moods of the giant, powerful adults around them.
They become radar systems.
Exactly. Their brain becomes hyper-attuned to micro-expressions, a slight tightening of the jaw, a shift in tone, a sudden withdrawal of affection. They learn that survival equates to pleasing others or remaining invisible. Because the human brain is deeply neuroplastic, this outward hypervigilance isn't just a habit. It becomes physically wired into the neural pathways as an automatic baseline state.
So the adult who genuinely believes they are just, a highly empathetic, caring person because they are constantly monitoring their partner's emotional state, how the shadow dictates adult behavior when we try to outrun that inner emptiness.
He does. They are perfect case studies.
Let's break those characters down because they are so recognizable. You have Alex, who uses intense intellectual achievement to build a fortress around himself.
Right. Alex uses data and intellect as a shield against vulnerability. By analyzing everything, he stays entirely in his head, completely disconnected from the messy, unpredictable realm of feeling. His shadow holds his deep fear of inadequacy, and his overachieving is just an exhaustive attempt to prove he has a right to exist.
Yeah. Then there's Amara, who bases her entire sense of worth on her physical appearance and the external validation it brings.
Amara illustrates the cognitive trap of outsourcing your existence to the gaze of others. She attempts to control her environment through aesthetic perfection.
The performance.
A total performance. And her shadow contains a profound sense of invisibility. She believes that if she stops performing beauty, she will basically cease to matter entirely.
And finally, Jacob, who is arguably the most volatile, swinging violently between rigid, obsessive control and complete self-destruction.
Jacob represents the immense, unsustainable tension of trying to hold the shadow down by force. He tries to micromanage his reality to prevent any pain, but the repressed energy eventually demands release, leading to those explosive periods of self-sabotage.
Seeing those characters struggle is a really heavy realization. Because we spend our adult lives treating these symptoms, the intellectualizing, the perfectionism, the obsessive control, as though they are fixed personality traits.
We say, oh, that's just who I am.
Exactly. When in reality, they're just the outdated neurological software we developed as kids to survive a chaotic world. It's like armor we forgot to take off.
The tragedy of unexamined trauma is that the very software that kept you safe in childhood becomes your prison in adulthood. The nervous system never downgrades its threat level. You spend your life scanning the horizon for predators that no longer exist. You can walk into a room and instantly diagnose the emotional state of a dozen strangers. But if someone asks you what you want or feel, you draw a complete blank. Healing initiates only when we stop criticizing these protective mechanisms and ask a different question. What specific, unresolved wound is this behavior still trying to guard?
But disarming those mechanisms is terrifying. If you stop the obsessive outward focus, if you finally power down that hypervigilant algorithm and drop the ego's meticulously crafted roles, you are left staring directly into that vast emptiness we mentioned earlier.
You encounter silence, pure, unadulterated space. For a mind addicted to the constant dopamine hits of anxiety, projection, and crisis management, that stillness initially feels agonizing.
It feels like death to the ego.
It does. Without the familiar looping thoughts about other people's opinions, you face a profound void. The standard human reaction at this threshold is panic. We immediately rush to fill the vacuum with a new obsession, a new romantic drama, or any available distraction.
We will do literally anything to avoid being alone with ourselves. Yet Jung believed that this void was the most crucial psychological space we could enter. It wasn't a dead zone, it was incredibly fertile ground.
Yes. Jung called this crossing the threshold into individuation. Individuation is the lifelong, often arduous process of integrating the shadow and becoming the complete, authentic self by turning the gaze inward.
You have to look inside.
You have to. You simply cannot cultivate an authentic identity if your consciousness is entirely saturated with managing the perceptions of others. Bandra mirrors this psychological process philosophically with his emphasis on presence. True peace and wholeness are not commodities you can acquire or achievements you can unlock. They are our default state, revealed only when the frantic activity of the ego ceases.
I really appreciate that Bandra doesn't frame this as like a grim, austere spiritual duty. One of the most surprising and effective elements in Finding Neve is his strategic use of humor. In the middle of these dense existential crises, the characters are constantly breaking the tension with jokes.
It's so clever, because humor is a profoundly effective mechanism for dismantling the ego. The ego demands to be taken seriously. It thrives on high stakes, drama, and a sense of grave self-importance.
Right, it wants everything to be life or death.
Exactly. But when you cultivate the ability to laugh at the absurdity of your own mental loops, you disrupt the ego's neurological pattern. You cannot be simultaneously trapped in a self-aggrandizing narrative and laughing at it. Humor brings a necessary lightness, reminding the reader that the goal isn't to violently wage war on the ego, but simply to stop taking its dramatic stories as absolute truth.
Let me play devil's advocate for the listener who is, sitting in traffic right now. It sounds incredibly poetic to embrace the fertile void and laugh at the ego. But when your brain is actively spiraling, when you are physically feeling that tightness in your chest and your thoughts are aggressively looping about a relationship falling apart, you can't just flip a switch and access inner peace.
Yeah.
What is the actual mechanical process for disrupting that state in the moment?
That is the pivotal question of applied psychology. The standard approach is harsh self-discipline. We mentally scream at ourselves to stop overthinking, or conversely, we lean heavily into the rumination, tricked by the brain into believing that if we just analyze the problem from one more angle, we will crack the code and find relief.
We think we're problem solving.
But we aren't. Rumination is a trap. It masquerades as problem solving while actually reinforcing the neural pathways of anxiety.
So if self-control and analysis fail, what is the functional tool?
The mechanism is gentle redirection, facilitated by the power of observation.
Observation.
Right. The precise microsecond you notice you are ruminating, the moment your internal monologue says, "Oh, I am currently looping on that conversation again," a profound cognitive uncoupling occurs.
Oh, because you caught yourself.
Exactly. In that fraction of a second, you are no longer the thought. You have successfully shifted into the observer of the thought. You have stepped out of the rushing river and onto the riverbank. You do not punish the thought, and you do not engage with its content. You simply acknowledge its presence, and then you anchor your attention to sensory reality, the rhythm of your breath, the physical sensation of your feet on the floor, the ambient sounds in the room.
You consciously reclaim the cognitive energy that the projection was stealing. And I guess if you perform that redirection 1,000 times a day, you gradually rewire the nervous system to tolerate stillness.
That's the work. You rebuild the individual.
Which brings us to the final, perhaps most complex hurdle. If reclaiming my energy heals me, and I stop projecting my unhealed wounds onto others, if I drop the enmeshment and I no longer need anyone to emotionally complete me, how do we engage in relationships at all?
Well, it requires a radical redefinition of love itself. Jung is remarkably blunt about this. He states that much of what society celebrates as romantic love is actually mutual psychological dependency.
Ouch.
Yeah, it's an implicit contract where two people use each other to regulate their anxieties and fill their respective inner voids. You make me feel secure, therefore I love you. But that architecture inherently breeds anxious, controlling attachment. Mature love, synthesized through both Jung and Bandra, operates on the principle of spaciousness.
Spaciousness. It implies an environment where both individuals have the oxygen to exist independently.
Yes. It is connection without the demand for emotional fusion. Bandra illustrates this with devastating beauty in Finding Neve through the relationship between Simran and her dying father. Despite the impending loss, their bond is completely devoid of the ego's need to possess or control.
It's a gorgeous scene.
When the father tells her, "Whenever you remember me, I'll be with you," he isn't offering a sentimental cliche. He is pointing toward a deeper philosophical reality. Love, in its most mature form, is the recognition of shared being that transcends physical proximity and ego attachment.
This introduces a term we need to clarify.
Yeah.
We're talking about moving into non-dualism, right?
Yeah, precisely. Non-dualism is the realization that the boundary between you and me is ultimately a cognitive illusion. Once the ego's rigid categories dissolve, you understand that we all arise from the same fundamental field of awareness. Loving someone else isn't about grasping an external object. It is about recognizing another expression of the same interconnected whole.
So what does this all mean for the listener? If I become this thoroughly grounded, individuated person who doesn't rely on a partner for my own emotional survival, doesn't that inherently make me detached?
It's a common fear, but it is the ultimate paradox of psychological development. The less desperately you require another person to serve as your emotional life raft, the more genuinely you are capable of loving them.
Because you're finally interacting with them, not just your own projections.
Exactly. You stop treating the other person as a utility for your nervous system. You move beyond the illusion of separation. When you operate from that shared consciousness, compassion, patience, and forgiveness do not require massive effort. They become the natural byproduct of understanding that we share the same underlying reality. You aren't detached. You are experiencing the only form of connection that is actually real.
However, we must be intellectually honest about the cost of this process. It is not a seamless transition.
No, it is not. It involves significant friction. Jung was adamant that the path of individuation guarantees loss. The grief of outgrowing old patterns is profound. When you stop abandoning yourself to maintain peace, you will inevitably begin setting boundaries, and you will quickly discover that certain relationships in your life were entirely sustained by your willingness to shrink or overfunction.
The people who benefited from you, being the perpetual rescuer, or the one who always took the blame to avoid conflict, they are going to resist this new, grounded version of you.
Yes. When you alter the unspoken terms of the contract and begin standing firmly in your own wholeness, the dynamic collapses. Some of those relationships will not survive the transition. You must mourn the fantasy that your exhaustive, obsessive devotion was ever going to secure permanent safety. But the alternative is to remain psychologically fragmented, forever living in reaction to the world.
Wow. Okay, to summarize the vast territory we've covered today, we begin trapped in the exhausting illusion that our obsessive mental looping is connection, when in reality, we are just projecting our own unprocessed fears onto others. We hide behind the constructed narratives of our ego to avoid the vulnerability of existence.
Right.
But if we can find the courage to silence the predictive algorithm, to sit in that highly uncomfortable but fertile emptiness, and practice the discipline of simply observing our thoughts instead of becoming them, we slowly return to wholeness. We stop demanding that other people save us from ourselves, which is the exact moment we finally become capable of truly loving them.
And if there is a foundational truth to carry forward from both Jung's psychology and Bondra's philosophy, it is this: you are not fundamentally broken. You are not the roles you perform. You are not the trauma you survived. And you are not the obsessive thoughts lipping in your mind.